Hi, and welcome to another episode of Politics Tech Lightning. In Azure, we have something called private link service, private endpoints, and service endpoints. Did I confuse you? Well, stay tuned as I break down these services in Azure and clearly explain when you should which and when. Here we go. Let's first get an eagle eye and build up the use case with these technologies. We have two companies that are not related, each with their own tenant and Azure environment. Company A has one subscription called A1 with a virtual network called A10. Company B, on the other hand, has two subscriptions, B1 and B2. In addition to this, they also have an on-premise environment with a DNS and other servers. In subscriptions B1, there are two virtual networks, which are called B10 and B11. Inside the B10 virtual network, there's a virtual machine. In the B2 subscription, we have a virtual network called B20. We'll leave it empty for now. So let's look at private endpoint. Now, in the B1 subscription, we create a storage account without a private endpoint. Accessing the storage account has to be done using the public DNS name. For blob storage, this is accessed then using blob.core.windows.net address. When you access the blob storage account from the VM in B10 virtual network, the traffic will be routed using the Microsoft backbone. There are very few controls on your end on how to control this traffic with regards to access and flow. Accessing the storage account from the on-premise environment is done through the public internet. It's not very secure as you have to traverse an external network, and the storage account has to allow access from the internet as that's where you access it from. Creating a private endpoint for the storage account is like a virtual network card. We will get a private IP address inside the virtual network subnet where this is created. Private link, you can think of this as the glue between the private endpoint and the storage account. When traffic hits the virtual network card, it continues to the storage account over the Microsoft backbone network. But since you now have a private IP address of the storage account, you can implement all kinds of controls. For example, you can use network security groups to define which source systems are allowed to access the account. The major benefit of having a private IP address, the private endpoint, is that you can have this routable from on-premise. You can from on-premise connect with a private connector to your Azure environment and access the storage account bypassing the public internet. Private endpoints, they work closely with DNS, so you have to set up DNS properly to get this working. I have a separate video regarding this, so if you want to deep dive into the DNS topic, check the video description. To make matters a bit more confusing, Microsoft also have something called private link service. Not to be confused with what you just talked about, private link. In subscription A1, there are a couple of virtual machines created with a standard load balancer. We can enable the private link service on the load balancer. This is how we tell Azure that this load balancer can be made accessible for other private endpoints, both internal to the Azure environment and external to this Azure environment. Enabling private link service does not mean that everyone in the whole world that's using Azure will be able to connect to the standard load balancers. There are restrictions and controls that you can enforce, such as RBAC, role-based access control. So this works within the same tenant where you can decide which users can actually see the private link service. You can restrict visibility based on subscription, so you can restrict it to any subscription within and outside the tenant. Anyone with an alias, so you have a specific alias for private link service, and if you give this alias to somebody, you can request a connection to be made with that alias, which you then will have to approve. In case the virtual machine in B10 need to connect to the load balancer, they will create a private endpoint and link it to the private link service. The administrators on the private link service will see the request come in and they will approve it if they are having a good day. Now, you have a way from the virtual machine in B10 to connect to the created private endpoint, which will use private link to connect to the private link service, which is the standard load balancer in the subscription A1. If you understood this sentence, you are awesome and you finally understand those concepts now. The last technology I want to explain and to make this fully complete is the service endpoints. We will create an SQL database, but we will not use any private endpoints. On the SQL database, you enable service endpoints. In order to access this database using the service endpoint, we need to tell the virtual machine in the subnet of B10 that the traffic to all Microsoft SQL databases should use service endpoints. Once we enable this option, whenever the virtual machine tries to connect to the SQL database using the public endpoint, the traffic will be securely routed using the Microsoft backbone. The benefit here is that you can tell the SQL database to only accept connections from the private IP address of the virtual machine. One security drawback is that it may be exposing your environment to data exfiltration. If a hacker has compromised data on the virtual machine in the B10 VNet, he may be able to access his own storage account, which is located in his own subscription. So this way he can maybe copy the data he has obtained to his storage account. This is what they mean with exfiltration of data. There are ways, such as service endpoint policies, to block and work around this. You can, for example, limit which storage account the virtual machine in VNet B10 has access to. However, they're not available for all the resources in Azure. The biggest drawback of using service endpoint is that it might not be possible to access these from other environments, such as on-premise. Your server on-premise cannot access the SQL database using a service endpoint. Access from on-premise will only be over the public internet unless you create a private endpoint for this service. Before we end, let's look at a summary of what we have learned today. Private endpoints, they're virtual network cards for PaaS services in Azure. They're injected into a service and provides a private IP address. They're accessible from on-premise and the most secure way to secure your workload. They require integration with DNS, and each private endpoint costs around 7 to 8 euros per month per endpoint. Private link is the service that glues the traffic to the PaaS services from the private endpoints. Accessing a private endpoint and the traffic traverses using private link through the Microsoft backbone to the PaaS service. Private link service is a way to expose Azure Standard Load Balancer to both internal and external Azure environments. Service endpoints are enabled on PaaS services and allows you to control that access to the resource is only from Azure and even down to a specific resource type. It can, however, be susceptible to data exfiltration. There is no cost to service endpoints, and any on-premise systems are not able to access it this way. That was all for this episode. If you're able to keep the terminology between private link and private link service separate, you're ahead for most of us. I highly recommend to check out my Azure Private DNS Resolver video if you want to deep dive into the setup and the integration of private endpoints, as DNS is key to this. Until next time, take care. See ya.